Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon, and today is going to be a relatively short video. It is going to be a reaction to a community post by Vlad. He has a huge channel, thousands of videos, almost 900,000 subscribers, and I want to react because he's talking about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, and I think he's dead wrong about it, and furthermore, he's passing it off onto the believer as it's their responsibility. So we're going to talk about that. But before we do that, I have some channel news for you. I know some people don't care about that. You can just go ahead and fast forward to the timestamp here, and you will be right on track with the video. But we're approaching 5,000 very rapidly. I think we'll be there in the next day or two, and I wanted to do something special. I had asked for some of your opinions, and it seems like a Q&A is something you guys would really like to do. So yesterday I posted on my community board just asking for questions. So I'm going to put a link to that post there. The Q&A video will be coming out this Sunday as our main Sunday video. So if there's any questions you have, there's nothing off limits. It doesn't mean I'll answer everything, but feel free to ask anything that you want. Just go to that community post and paste in your question, and I will get to it on Sunday's video. So let's get into today's video first by looking at the post by Vlad. 9 times it says Pharaoh hardened his heart, while some passages say God hardened his heart. It wasn't until the 6th plague that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Before that, Pharaoh's heart grew hard until it became hard. I think he meant hard there. If we keep resisting God, he will eventually let us follow our own choices. Romans 1:24, 26, and 28. Pharaoh resisted God so much that he found himself in a place where he couldn't change. That's scary. Don't be like Pharaoh. Keep your heart tender toward God. He just posted this a few days ago. Over 6,500 people have liked it, and there's 167 comments that I think are all pretty ridiculous. So what do I do when I see something like this? What should you do as a believer, as a doubter, as someone who is in the process of deconverting when you see something like this? Do we just believe the message, blame ourselves, which is what the Christian message so often tells us that the problem is, repent, try harder, dig into the word, and hope for the best? Or should we look at this with some scrutiny and some curiosity? I think the latter. So the first thing that I'd want to do is see, what is he referring to in these verses in Romans? I've got my ESV Bible here. We're going to look those up. Then we're going to look at the verses in Exodus and actually see what is happening here. And if you haven't yet, quick plug to watch our secular Bible study series, specifically our episode on Exodus, where I cover some of this, but not to the detail that we're going to go through today. I'll talk about the problematic nature of this concept in general and how Vlad's advice is the exact opposite based off what we see here in Scripture. Okay, 1:24. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. Then he also says 26, which is, for this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And 28, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. So the proper way of talking about these verses in Christian circles is God will give you over to your sin, or God will allow you to sin because of your free will. I think that the severe irony of what we're talking about here today is how Christians have taken this thing that is obviously God stripping you of your will and letting consequences just play out as they may, to deliberately, in this particular case, harden your heart so that it's harder for you to do so. So there's some Christian apologetics around these verses in Romans that's saying God isn't doing anything like what we see in the Old Testament with hardening hearts. He's just simply choosing to intervene less. He may have been trying to pull you in. He may have been working through other people as vessels to encourage you and motivate you. He's no longer going to be pulling any strings. You're just going to be living according to your free will. So this is where we have an issue, right? Either God was already manipulating your free will and trying to call you and trying to better things in your life so that you would see benefit in him, or instructing others to minister to you, etc. And now, because you've continued to sin despite all of his interfering in your will, he's removing that interference, and now you're actually getting free will for the first time. And in doing so, you're going to continue your natural patterns of behavior. In the case of verse 26, it is women who are lesbians. They're going to continue this sinful behavior because God is no longer intervening. That's one way to see it. And I think we can all see the problem with the fact that God wasn't giving free will at the beginning. The only other way to see it is that God was letting us all have our free will. And with that free will, these people chose these sexual sins and lifestyles that were against God. And so now he's going further. He's hardening their hearts. He's locking them into that sin. He's making it harder for them to find him. So he wasn't affecting their will, but now after so much sinning, he is affecting their will in the negative sense. Either way, and I don't care how you justify this, we have a God who is interrupting and interfering with will. Quick plug for my free will video, because I think that it's really important that you understand why this is so bothersome to me and why it should be bothersome to any believer. If God is indeed willing, either on the positive sense or the negative sense, to interfere with your will, then it completely eradicates the entire excuse for the problem of suffering or the problem of evil. Supposedly those things exist in this world because God had to give us free will. I need consistency. I need there to be a God that doesn't interfere ever, or that does interfere and so will interfere to alleviate suffering, because supposedly he's a benevolent God that cares about the suffering of his people. But this middle ground where he does interfere, but it's sometimes to help you, sometimes to hurt you, and there's no consistency, and he does with some people but not other people, that's where I have the biggest problem with this God. So yeah, you can point to Old Testament verses and say how problematic it is and how obviously God interrupted free will, but post Jesus he doesn't. Wrong. However you read this, it falls apart. But now let's go back to Exodus. The main plagues happen between Exodus 8 and 10, and this is where we see a cycle of Moses and Aaron coming before Pharaoh saying, my God's going to do this to you if you don't let us go. Pharaoh saying, no, I'm still not going to. The bad thing happens. Pharaoh gets upset. He says, maybe, ends up being a no. Another bad thing happens. 10 times we get the 10 plagues. Let's go through, and I'm not going to read you the entire 3 chapters, but I am going to show you the pattern here and where it switches from Pharaoh's heart being hard to God hardening Pharaoh's heart, and we'll see if we still think that this post by Vlad means anything at all for the believer. Okay, sorry, it's actually chapter 7, verse 14, so halfway through chapter 7, where we have the first plague, water turns to blood. And what I'm going to do with each of these is just read you like one of the last lines so you can see. Verse 23, Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and he did not take even this to heart. So all we see here is no hard heart yet. This just didn't change his mind. By the way, we could stop right here and say, what did this ancient tribe mean by heart, right? People still thought you actually thought with your heart back then. So we use heart in a more romantic sense, and so does the Bible sometimes, as a feeling center. But the ancient traditions of this time had the heart being also the thinking center. You would hear concepts like a fatty heart, a weak heart, a hardened heart, and these all meant very different things, and it had more to do with your logic and rationale and how you were thinking about something and how stubborn you were being, etc. So again, we could get sidetracked there, but I think it works either way, and we'll just continue on. The second plague is frogs. This is just going to be a fun little refresher for you if it's been a while since you've been through this. Everything happens, and what is Pharaoh's response? He hardened his heart and would not listen to them as the Lord had said. So the plague was bad. Pharaoh didn't like it. He was thinking about giving in. The plague let up, and then Pharaoh was like, no, I don't have to. The bad thing's over. So now we have our first instance of Pharaoh hardening his heart. And it wasn't like a sit down, let's think about this and make a choice. It was just a natural response. The threat is over. I'm keeping my slaves until the next threat, which is going to be the third plague, which is gnats. In verse 19, then the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God, but Pharaoh's heart was hardened and he would not listen to them. Okay, so we have a doubling down of the hardened heart. Then we move on to the fourth plague, flies, and Pharaoh's reply is verse 32, but Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also and did not let the people go. Okay, the fifth plague is the livestock die, and Pharaoh's response in verse 7 is, but the heart of Pharaoh was hardened and he did not let the people go. This is our first one that has a little more ambiguity to it. This one is just his heart was hardened. It doesn't say that he did it, and starting in the next one we're going to see that God did it. So it's like this transition phase. The narrative structure here is really, really interesting. I'd like to point out that in no way does this make sense, right? If you really have these prophets of God, Moses and Aaron, coming up saying, I'm going to do exactly this, and then they stretch out their arms and exactly that happens, and it's horrific, and it can end if you let your slaves go. I can see maybe saying no once, maybe even twice, and it looks very mythological. It looks like folklore. It looks like a great tale. We have this nice even number 10 that meant something in the ancient days back then that we would have been alluding to. We want to see the plagues get progressively stronger because we want to see the might of God grow. But as this gets worse and worse and you see him continue to be hardened, you have to think either this is just a story or God had to do this for him. And we're going to see that right now when we get to the sixth plague, boils. And how does Pharaoh respond? Verse 12, but the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had spoken to Moses. So the way that I interpret this, and I think anyone that is just logically reading the text is, okay, Pharaoh was really stubborn for the first 5. It's getting more serious. This plague of boils was really bad. His magicians couldn't stand and do their magic anymore, which, by the way, we're just going to acknowledge that there was other magic in the world at this time. And I know Christians will say, oh, it was the devil with his demons. It's never referenced here. This is just magicians. Just like in the Old Testament, you have witchcraft and all of these other things. Like, this is what people believed. We can try to attribute it to demons now and make you feel better that there's really only this one deity and his enemy, but that is not what these people believed back then. So getting back to Vlad's post, he says, it wasn't until the 6th plague that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Before that, Pharaoh's heart grew hard until it became hard. So he's trying to make an excuse for God clearly interrupting the will of Pharaoh by saying, nope, it was already in the process of growing hard, and then it reached its final inevitable conclusion of becoming fully hard. It doesn't make any sense. It's not what the scriptures are saying. We now see that apparently, in contrast, Pharaoh would have been open to letting these people go, and God said no. But we'll continue to read and see how it holds up. The 7th plague is hail. And if we see Pharaoh's reaction in verse 35, so the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people of Israel go, just as the Lord had spoken through Moses. So we're back to that passive verb of was hardened, but after the context of God being the one who did the hardening on the 6th plague, I think we can still attribute this to God. The 8th plague is locusts, and Pharaoh's response in verse 20, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the people of Israel go. Okay, we're back to it clearly being God here. And by the way, if God is having to harden Pharaoh's heart, what does that mean is the state of Pharaoh's heart without God, not hardened? These plagues were working. Now, this happened in the last one as well, but I'm going to read you a little bit more of this one. Verse 16 of chapter 10, then Pharaoh hastily called Moses and Aaron and said, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now therefore forgive my sin and plead with the Lord your God only to remove this death from me. So again, we have Pharaoh's admittance that he is the one sinning. He is the one messing up, that this God is real, that this God is powerful. We didn't have that admittance earlier. The plagues have done their job. All right, God, let's let the people go. It's God holding his own people in captivity at this point, 100%. Even if he didn't harden Pharaoh's heart, the plagues alone are an interruption of man's free will. This is the point that I could just drop the Bible and we could turn off the camera. Christians want to debate all day if God interrupted the free will of Pharaoh by hardening his heart. The answer is clearly yes, and we're going to continue to show that. But even if he didn't, even if he just sent the very first plague, and then Pharaoh did whatever he was going to do of his own volition, God has intervened. God has changed history here. God chose a side and acted on their behalf. This is the opposite of free will. How any Christian ever still maintains that there is free will is baffling to me. Let's move on to the 9th plague, darkness. I'm going to back up just a little bit instead of what we've been doing, and we'll read verse 24. Then Pharaoh called Moses and said, go serve the Lord. Your little ones also may go with you. Only let your flocks and your herds remain behind. He had been previously bargaining like, okay, you can go, but just the men. Okay, you and the women can go, you, the women and the children, but I still want your livestock. Like, again, so stupid and obviously man-made. You're going to tell me that after the boils and the hail and the darkness, etc., like Pharaoh was like, it's still worth it to play this game with God where I know I'll get another plague and I know it will escalate to something even worse, but I really want to hang on to their livestock. It's absolutely absurd. No, this did not happen. And by the way, going back to episode 2 of Secular Bible Study, the whole thing here didn't happen. There were no Jews in captivity at this time and anywhere near this number. There was no Exodus. It's all ridiculous. So to even make this story, and then according to Vlad, try to make it something that actually happened and learn a lesson from it, that isn't that God is just tyrannical and abandons the whole concept of free will, but that it's you, the sinner, to do something, come on. All right, let's move on. Sorry, let me get back to it. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. All I hear in these passages is that Pharaoh was totally ready. They were having a negotiation. He was probably about to let the livestock go as well. And then God hardens his heart so he can perform his last and best plague. He's got one card left up his sleeve, and he really wants to play it. Next, we don't go straight to the final plague. We get a threat of the final plague. And once again, in chapter 11, verse 10, Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the people of Israel go out of the land, not even with the threat of all this death coming, and no reason that Pharaoh would not believe that this was indeed coming. Pharaoh's a believer. He believes in this God. He's admitted it's his own sin. The only thing preventing these slaves from this exodus is God. Next comes the Passover, where they use a lot of actual blood magic to protect the lives from the spell that their God is going to place. The 10th plague happens, the death of the firstborn. The text says that not one house in Egypt was left without someone dying. That to me is nothing but innocent bloodshed of children. Firstborns could be older at this point, but they're most likely going to be a ton of children that are affected by this. The very fact that this wasn't recorded in any Egyptian history when Egypt was one of the best record keepers of the ancient world, that time that, I don't know, every single firstborn happened to die at the exact same time on the exact same night. But I digress. The point here isn't to prove how ridiculous the Exodus story is and that it indeed did not happen. It is to talk about this issue with free will. So what do we see? This plague happens, and Pharaoh finally says, okay, go. Take all the things you wanted to and go. Notice the omission of something that we typically see. God did not harden Pharaoh's heart, and now Pharaoh says, go. Seems like God could have done that 4 plagues ago. So not only do we have an interruption of will with Pharaoh and an interruption of will with utilizing plagues, but the interruption of will to commit this horrendous mass murder to the innocents of the land of Egypt is without excuse. And just for good measure, I'm going to skip forward to chapter 14. This will be the last thing I read today. Verse 3, and this is God talking to Moses. For Pharaoh will save the people of Israel. They are wandering in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host. And the Egyptians shall know that I am Lord. And they did so. The Egyptians already know this God is real. If everything just happened that these last 10 plagues happened, they already know, but this wasn't good enough for God. His perfect number of 10 plagues wasn't good enough. He said, no, I will make them change their minds again, more interruption of free will, and come after you so that I can have you do another miracle, crossing the Red Sea, so I can crash in the sea on them and kill more of them. If the whole goal was that all of Egypt would know this is God, then where's the record of it? Where's the record of the Egyptians turning from their pagan ways and worshiping Yahweh? So not only is the story obviously ridiculous and we have the issue with free will, but God sucks at planning. It didn't even work. Egypt has never claimed Yahweh as their chosen deity. How ineffectual can you be and yet so destructive at the same time? So, with all of that in mind, let's get back to Vlad as he preaches to his almost 1 million people that are subscribed to his channel. And what does he tell them they can glean from this story? If we keep resisting God, he will eventually let us follow our own choices. Pharaoh resisted God so much that he found himself in a place where he couldn't change. That's scary. Don't be like Pharaoh. Keep your heart tender toward God. I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say Pharaoh did nothing wrong in this confined situation. Was he wrong for owning slaves? Sure. Did he probably go to war and conquer other people? Absolutely. Let me ask it better this way. Tell me something Pharaoh and the Egyptians did that God and the Israelites did not immediately do themselves in what we see of the rest of the story in the next 3 books, and even further in Joshua and Judges, etc. Name one thing. So for this objective morality, it doesn't seem to be anything but subjective. If God commands it, it's good. If Pharaoh does it, it's bad. I'm going to give you a hint here to the pop quiz at the end. That's not objective morality. That's my God is the mightiest. He makes things the rightest. That's it. So yes, I can judge God and the Israelites as much as I can judge Pharaoh and the Egyptians. But if I am Pharaoh or the Egyptians in that situation where a foreign deity is coming after us and harming us over and over and over, I'm probably going to grow a hard heart. I'm probably going to be like, this God sucks. So yes, Christians, keep your hearts tender towards God, whatever that means, as if that's somehow in your control. But when God purposely interrupts your free will to dish out divine punishment on you to the point where you're like, I don't know if this is a good God, and then he interrupts your will again to make your heart hard so you continue in the sinful act you were doing so he can punish you more and then eventually eternally, we're okay with this? Vlad's message here is that's still a good God? It seems to me that Vlad's message at the end of that should be one of 2 things. This God is not real, so don't worry, or this God is real and I'm giving you this warning because he's a monster. But it should not be mixed in with the message of love and of the gospel and of saving grace and all of the other horrendous things that Christians and Vlad on his channel have tried to make it about. Stop blaming the believer for their sin. God made this nature. He allowed it. He foresaw it. He created it. He intervenes or doesn't intervene at his leisure, and yet he punishes it all just the same. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. I hope that maybe you were able to approach this story with some clearer lenses this time, without the Christian bias of a good God looming over you or some ridiculous excuse for free will. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Please subscribe if you have not. Be sure to go to the post and submit any questions you have for the Q&A on Sunday. We have Judges coming up for this Thursday secular Bible study. We'll have a quick Saturday video, and then again the Q&A on Sunday. So until then, keep thinking.